all our guests to this IIT webinar, which we'll be putting on jointly with a few of our partner institutions. So the Australian Industries Group, represented today by Louise McGrath, the Institute for South Asian Studies at the NUS in Singapore, represented by Amitendra Pilot, and of course the Confederation for Indian Industries in India, represented by Pranav Kumar. So it's a great pleasure for us as the IIT to be hosting this today, and I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation, and it's an interesting hour and a half ahead of us. I'd also like to welcome all guests who've joined us and taken the time to be with us today. I'm going to start with a very brief framing, and then I'll turn to the panel and then introduce them as we proceed. So I'll start with making an obvious point around geopolitics, which is that now is really the time for the India-Australia relationship to mature. We have a predominantly Australian audience today, and they will all know, of course, about the sharpening of contestation in the bilateral relationship with China. China, of course, being Australia's major market, and therefore the issue of diversification of markets of investment outlets is a major topic of conversation in the Australian debate. That gives rise to a number of questions, the most obvious of which is there a market of sufficient scale to replace China? And clearly, if you look around the world, the very obvious candidate is India. And that brings India sharply into focus from a narrowly economic and geopolitical perspective for Australia. But there's much more going on in the broader set of relations. Since we focused on trade for today, and since all of us on this panel are trade people, we take a particular interest in the fortunes of the multilateral trading system. There's the ministerial conference coming up at the end of this year, the MC12. And so India and Australia, sadly, are often on different sides of the trenches when it comes to the WTO. But there's a set of issues to explore, and I'm sure we're going to touch on them as the conversation proceeds. So what can be done in the WTO context to, in a sense, rescue that institution from the ongoing crisis, I would argue, that it faces. There's also a very productive potential agenda in the regional space. I think certainly from an Australian perspective, we would very much like to see India back in the regional comprehensive economic partnership. India, of course, pulled out of that arrangement relatively recently. But we would argue it belongs in that arrangement and would strongly encourage India to re-engage. And we're hopeful that at some point when India has gone through certain processes, so domestic reform processes particularly, that would become a possibility again. And then, of course, in the bilateral partnership, there's long been talk about a free trade agreement that's been stalled for a long time. I don't think that's currently really on the agenda in a meaningful way. But there's a whole set of trade and investment interactions that are going on. The relationship is still building on a number of levels. And certainly that's going to be a focus of our conversation today as well. And then again, narrowly from an Australian perspective, for us, a lot of the potential is anchored in India's domestic reform agenda, economic reform agenda. And that is where we're going to start with a preview and an overview of what's going on at a fairly high level in that reform agenda. And that brings me to our first panelist, and that's Amitendra Pilot from the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore, currently sitting in India, who's going to speak to that domestic reform agenda. So Amitendra, I'll hand over to you, and if you could frame that in about 15 minutes or so.
Thank you so much, Peter, and a very good afternoon, good evening to some of you, depending on where you are located at this stage, and a great pleasure for me to be a part of this joint initiative. The first, I suspect, that is being done between the Institute for International Trade at Adelaide University, the ISAs at NUS, and also with the CII in India, and the Australian Business Council. I really look forward to the conversation that we are going to have today, and I would hope to bring to you a kind of a big picture of a lot of action that has happened on the Indian policy front since the outbreak of the COVID-19, which has been living with the world for roughly 18 months now, or a little more than that. And before I dive into that, I'd like to, in advance, apologize for some unexpected but bit obtrusive repair work which has suddenly started around me 30 minutes ago. So you might hear some, none too pleasant thuds suddenly accompanying the content that I'm trying to convey. So my advance apologies for that. So with that, let me now try to take you through into this gamut of the policy space expansion that has happened in India since, I would say, end of April to early May 2020, from the time that we have come through till now. And I would obviously not try to take you through each and every policy, but I think what I'll try to do is to broadly share with you some basic objectives, agenda, and understanding of the policy in this respect. Now, one of the things that I think has really caught on insofar as the connection, imagination, conversation regarding India in a post-COVID context is concerned is the use of this phrase Atmanirbhar. And this is a phrase which has been popularized from the time Prime Minister Modi alluded to it. The phrase means self-reliance. And there's a lot of talk, sometimes ambiguous, sometimes confused, sometimes inquisitive about what exactly does India's quest for being an Atmanirbhar or a self-reliant economy mean. And for those of us who are familiar with India's economic history, there is an allusion to the self-sufficiency concept that was there in the beginning of India's 5-year plan history from the 1950s. So whether self-sufficiency means self-reliance as being promoted now is, of course, a different thought. But I think broadly speaking, one can summarize the intention of India trying to become a self-reliant notion as simply as something which is intended towards increasing what I would call are the domestic and local manufacturing capabilities. Now, I think there are sufficient contemporary examples to point to that there are countries, including Australia's sovereign manufacturing plan, which has just come out some time ago, that there are areas where countries would clearly be much more focused than before in order to increase their domestic capabilities. And this is entirely driven by two sets of factors. The first is, of course, the disruptions that arose out of the pandemic beginning from February, March 2020 onward. First with the economic shutdowns in China, then subsequently in Southeast Asia, which pointed to the difficulties and risks that supply chains encounter as a result of their excessive sourcing concentration. And then subsequently, the geopolitics that surrounded the relationships between China and a large number of other Indo-Pacific countries, all combining towards the broader objective of trying to make the supply chains far more resilient in the sense of they're not getting affected by what might happen in China or the rest of the region, either purposefully or through purely economic catastrophes like the COVID. So what India's specific intent in this regard has been is to propose a policy which is defined as production-linked incentives. And the production-linked incentives are looking to be fairly big. There's an amount of almost, I would say, $270 billion that are being put out in this regard across 13 industries, which include industries like pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, electronics, chemicals, textiles, and so on and so forth. Now, the point over here is, I think that if one compares the efforts by India to financially incentivize more of domestic production or inward location of parts of the supply chain within itself over the period of next 5 years. It kind of resonates with the character of the industries that one gets to be taken up for similar emphasis, like say in the United States 100-day supply chain review, or maybe in the Australian sovereign manufacturing capability plan, or even in the Chinese dual circulation strategy plan that has been put out of late. And these all are getting tied down to greater domestic nurturing of industries, which are number one, connected very closely to the national security objective. And that now is not really separable from the public health objectives. So pharmaceuticals clearly become one of the key points of attention as far as nurturing domestic capabilities are concerned. And then the rest of the focus brings in industries which are defined as critical technology industries, so semiconductors, electronics, telecommunication, where of course industries are distinguished by the fact that technology can play the very important role of serving to daily needs and inclusive objectives. But at the same time, they can also fashion very critical national security goals. And this, I think, is coming to convergence with a series of initiatives, which is not just happening within India, but also across the Indo-Pacific, a range of middle powers, Japan and Australia particularly, with whom India has started working quite closely within the space of the Quad partnership, where vaccine partnership, climate change, and critical and emerging technology industries are clearly the areas where there is considerable focus, collective focus on working on. But the point over here that is often asked with respect to the production-linked incentive schemes that India is encouraging, much as it is inviting foreign investment participation in a very, very big way, is that does this mean India is working back on the path of import substitution in a big way? Does this essentially mean that the greater domestic focus under the narrative of self-reliance will actually mean India turning inward? And I think one of the reasons why this concern is being expressly floated is that over the last 5 to 6 years, and particularly within the last 2 years, there has been a fairly sharp escalation in customs duties that India has imposed across the board on a large number of items. But I think the issue probably is something which will reveal a clear answer only after 3 to 4 to 5 years, after one gets to understand that what exactly has been the ability of these incentives across industries to excite the investors to come into India in a big way by expanding their capacities. But having said that, the customs duty management remains a critical part of India in ensuring the success of these PLI schemes. And I'm quite sure my good friend and colleague Pranav will have more to speak on this from an industry perspective. But the larger issue that is shaping up over here is that while customs duties to an extent might serve the larger objective of protection, however efficient or inefficient that might be as an economic rationale, they should not come into the way of India being obstructed in playing a bigger role in global supply chains. So if these duties are positioned in such a way that they cascade onto inputs and raw materials, making them far more expensive for Indian assemblers to obtain parts and components, then that could unfortunately mean some diminution of prospects as far as the whole Atmanirbhar program is concerned through the production-linked incentives. But clearly, this is an area where these synergies, and here I'm mindful of the large presence of the Australian experts that we have with us today, where the synergies with Australia are clearly very high. And when one looks at industries like critical minerals, where already there is sufficient work that's in the pipeline that's going on between Indian and Australian industries and at the government level, or even at the level of partnership on vaccines, I think these are clearly the areas where the prospect of production being incentivized for increasing greater capacities in a big economy like India holds sufficient reason to actually give the foreign investors a close look through on what is going on over here. Now, let me move on to the second component of what is rather striking about India's current economic policies. And this, again, comes from a particular illustration and understanding of the concept of self-reliance, which has been repeatedly alluded to by the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. The Atmanirbhar goal, or the self-reliant goal, has come connected with a range of dense structural reforms. And I would like to pick up three elements of these structural reforms, which have a tremendous possibility of making India structurally a very different economy. The first of these is the very aggressive focus on privatization of state-owned enterprises. And by now, today, there is a clear policy objective which is there in the Indian government, spelling out the path ahead for privatization, which divides industries that are owned by the state into two blocks, which are called the strategic blocks and the non-strategic blocks. And the strategic blocks, as expectedly, include industries like atomic energy, space, defense, transport, telecom, energy, the old energy and the new energy, as well as the financial sector, where the stated government objective is to retain very basic minimum public or state-owned enterprise presence and push the rest of those, as much of it can be merged or privatized. And as far as the rest of the industries are concerned, which are outside the scope of the strategic sectors, the rest of the industries are either going to be privatized or, very strikingly, this is the point that has been mentioned in the budget speech, or these industries would be closed, in the sense that there is a decisive view that the government really needs to retreat insofar as its presence in the non-strategic sectors of the economy are concerned in a very big and significant way. And the latest budget that was produced in February 2021 actually brought up certain companies owned by the government, big companies, the Life Insurance Corporation of India, certain public sector banks, which are either going to be corporatized or are on the route to privatization. We all know about the efforts by the government to privatize the Indian Airlines for a very long period of time, which has run into some rough weather. But I guess, given the complications involved in India's regulatory space, there will be challenges. But I think for the first time, what the privatization policy makes very clear is that, unlike in the past, when privatization was essentially limited to chipping off little bits of government equity from the government-owned enterprises, this time, the entire objective is to radically change the ownership of these enterprises, which clearly makes it, again, a basket of opportunities that can be looked at very closely by foreign investors, and particularly investors from Australia, because I'm quite sure that, given the current state of relations that India has with China, China will not be looked up to as a preferred investor in a large number of these areas, rather strategic partners with whom relationships have bonded almost organically. Australia, Japan, and of course the US and countries from the West are going to be the preferred investors in this regard. The second part of the agricultural, my apologies, the second part of the Atmanirbhar exercise has focused on the agriculture sector. Now, this again is a bit of a game changer, because Indian economic reforms and policies have traditionally shied away from making very decisive moves in the agriculture and farming sector, largely because of the extremely important role that Indian states have to play in that regard, and getting them on board is not easy. And also because of the very complicated political economy that governs the set of incentives in agriculture production and management. Now, on that, this time, the government has really, I would say, stuck its neck out in announcing a number of policies which ensures that farmers can directly approach the buyer without going through intermediaries that are the state agents in between them in terms of the procurement agents and marketing committees. They are allowed to stockpile grains or cereals or their produce in order to ensure that they can have the minimum amount of stock in their custody, so much so that they can respond to external market-based orders as fast as possible. But predictably enough, these policies have encountered political resistance, and the political resistance in India on these policies continues. The resistance has been coming up into conversation or receding from conversation depending upon the way the pandemic has been ebbing or rising in India. But the fact of the matter is that the agriculture sector in India, the way it is organized till now, in terms of the structures of incentives, the roles of the states, particularly the state governments, the people involved, is a very complex political economy, and dismantling it is not going to be easy. It's going to be challenging for the government, and one hopes that as one goes ahead, there will be some light at the end of the day, because these reforms are extremely important for India. The third point that I would like to mention in the context of the structural reforms is the great, I would say, foresight that has been shown by Indian policymakers in commercializing the minerals and coal mining and broader mining sectors. This is an area where privatization was held back for a very long time. Today, private enterprise, and again, an area which I'm sure will be of interest to my Australian friends, this is again an area where there is the clear intention to engage with foreign businesses to ensure that not only do the best standards of mining come into place as far as the domestic industry is concerned, but also the fact that when it comes to critical minerals, the objectives of responding well to the resilience of critical mineral and rare earth supply chains get backed by a good set of proactive outward-looking policies that enables India to work closely with partner countries. My third and last point in this regard will be with respect to one interesting emphasis that seems to be at the bottom of, by and large, all policies that are being taken by India and have been taken since the last 1.5 years. This is this very distinguishable emphasis on the clean and green. I think if one looks closely at the character of the policies that India has been announcing, there are two elements that come out very clearly. The first, there's this strong commitment. I mean, this commitment obviously comes out of the historical commitment that India has been making in terms of cleaning up the carbon targets, fixing the targets for renewables, particularly in solar power, wind, and allowing budgetary support for it. But also at the same time, taking the view that these targets are not going to be achievable unless there are substantial organizational functional changes that take place in the way enterprises function, in the way business actors and government actors connect to enterprises, including the consumers. And that is where the focus on digital functioning has become very exclusive. So I would say that the clean and the digital inclusion policies are almost going hand in hand. And in a sense, the COVID-19 has accelerated the impetus for it. And what I particularly find striking is that the clean and green is no more an impulse that is limited to the state sector. The corporates have entered into the activity and the agenda setting in an extremely significant way. So one gets to see the giant corporate houses in India, for example, the Reliance Industries or the Tata Group, actually stepping up to the goal in a very effective and purposeful fashion. So when it comes to, again, engagement with strategic partners like Australia, Japan, and European Union, I think in a sense it has become relatively easier for India now to communicate much more closely and effectively on the questions of sustainable industrial and trade practices, which earlier used to be some bits of gap creation in communication between India and its partners on that side. So let me now try to summarize a few of these into what I think might be the kind of the future perspectives as far as going ahead with India is concerned. And Peter, taking up what you shared in your early remarks, I'll try to make myself focused on the question of trade. We all know that in November 2019, India backed out of the RCEP agreement, and the ripples of that exit are still being felt in a large number of conversations surrounding India and the region. Now, as of now, the way things stand, there is hardly any possibility of India rejoining the RCEP negotiations. I think that is a view that is well understood by India as well as the RCEP club. But having said that, there's a point that I wanted to highlight. If one looks closely at the RCEP club, India has existing free trade agreements going with all of the members except 3. And these are Australia, New Zealand, and China, respectively. And what I also can share with the group today, and Pranav will back me on this, is that over the last 4 to 5 months, there has been a fairly pronounced proactivity within the Indian policy establishment to re-engage in trade negotiations. That doesn't include the RCEP, but it includes picking up the thread on where negotiations were left with Australia, trying to revive some purposeful conversation with New Zealand, and also at the same time getting actively engaged with trade partners in the West, and that includes the European Union, the United Kingdom. With the United Kingdom, the enhanced trade partnership is already taking effect, and the United Kingdom might be one of the earliest, if not the first country with whom India might be able to strike a bilateral FTA, let's say within the next 8 to 10 months. The European Union negotiations have begun. The whole idea and the sense that one gets out of this is that India is not withdrawing from trade negotiations. India continues to remain engaged in trade negotiations, but it is being selective. Now, one can debate and argue about the rationale that guides this selectivity. But clearly, within the Indian establishment, there is a perceived wisdom about the countries with which it should engage on the trade side and the way it should engage in trade side. So my sense over here again is that India might not, looking ahead in the future, be one of those countries which really is ready to latch on to the entire structure and template of a 21st century FTA. But at the same time, it might still be a country, it might very much be a country, which on the basis of its national interest, the way it derived, might be a country which would be very willing to engage in trade talks, albeit with relatively limited scope. I think that scope again is going to vary between partners and countries. And when it comes to the Asia Pacific, I think India's views by now are pretty much clear. China clearly is not a country with which India is going to engage in formal trade negotiations. And the RCEP community in that respect is clearly a no-no for India, because the political relations with China continue to remain tense and sour. I don't think there is enough political conviction, geopolitical conviction in pushing India into the RCEP in that regard. But having said that, RCEP members remain open at individual or collective level for future conversations and negotiations. And I think that tendency is pretty clear, because even within the scope of Indo-Pacific, India has not lost the opportunity in articulating within the Quad the importance of the ASEAN centrality. So Southeast Asia in that way remains important in the larger scheme of things. So with all this at this point in time, let me just conclude with one final fact. Yesterday, the International Monetary Fund came out with its latest estimate, revising downward India's growth prospects for the current year below double digit. The reason why I say below double digit is that it's still expected to grow at 9.5%, despite being one of those countries where the incidence of the COVID has been the highest, which is clearly reflective of the unspent economic potential that is there in the country, the large amount of energy that exists within the country on this, and the fact that 9.5 is too much of a tall number for any of the major economies of the world today, including perhaps China. So for a $3 trillion economy, a 9.5% increase, a fair bit of contribution to the rest of the world. 300 billion is not a small number. So I'll leave myself on that note. Peter, thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much, Amitendra. There was a formidable tour d'horizon, and I'm sure there's much more you could have said. I'm going to turn now to Louise McGrath to provide a perspective from Australian business. Louise, over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter. So you raised the question at the start, is India a replacement for China? And I'm not sure it really ever can be, and certainly not at the moment, because let's be frank, China decided that they wanted the world to trade with them, and they made it very easy, particularly for Australian companies who wanted to buy product from China, but also for our exporters. And it's no accident that 125 countries have China as their largest trading partner. So it's not a like for like for a lot of Australian companies, and certainly not in their minds. So it's what we've been looking at is how do we give companies the confidence to look at India and think of it as a strategic partner. But as a manufacturing association, especially once Australia liberalised its economy, for many of our members, their first interaction with China was as a customer, not as a seller. So that power balance is quite different. And their positive experience then led to investment and further collaboration and supply chain integration. However, our companies aren't slow. They can see the changing winds, and they're certainly now looking for other options, particularly across Asia. And India could certainly be one alternative partner. And as been outlined, there's a number of structural reforms that could make India more attractive. But I think there's a lot of work to be done to raise that awareness. So earlier this year, we worked with Austrade to conduct a survey and a number of individual consultations with members and other associations, so we could develop a roadmap that would give companies that confidence to have a look at India. And what we found was very interesting, principally that while many companies had looked at India and decided it wasn't the market for them, their opinions were pretty outdated. So they looked once, decided it didn't work for whatever reason, and that was it, moved on to the rest of the world as if India was frozen in time. So what we really think that we need companies to have another look at India post-reforms and even just societal changes to see if the market had been more attractive. And so we really think we need to reintroduce India. So perhaps this webinar is a good start to get Australian companies to have a second look or just to have a look at the new India. But it needs specific information, talking about the big numbers, what is it, 1.3 billion people, 1.4 billion people, that's too big, it's not enough. It's not actually understanding what are the opportunities for Australian businesses, because all those people may, probably aren't going to be the customer. And a lot of companies in Australia would be happy with a market of 3 or 4 million or 5 million to really focus on and invest in and get results from. So we really need to be quite nuanced in how we communicate about the opportunities of India. Big numbers aren't the answer. Actual sort of truth and not sugarcoating what the situation is and really carving out what the opportunities are. So a lot of our members didn't actually raise a full-scale FTA as a priority. And I'm interested in the news that there is a bit more appetite for trade negotiations, but I do wonder if an FTA is the best strategy to drive our relationship forward. If India is committed to self-reliance, does using an external force like an FTA to drive domestic regulatory change really the pathway to success? And given the challenges for reform in any country and some of the challenges that have already been outlined that India is facing, for example, in the agriculture sector, we just look at Brexit. Countries like to make their own rules, and negotiating away that right isn't always the best strategy. But what was very clear with particular sectors that there was a need for government-to-government engagement. So, as I say, don't eat the elephant all at once. Start at the tip. So perhaps we start at government-to-government engagement with limited agreements in particular areas such as critical minerals, perhaps agricultural technology, innovations, really niche areas where there's mutual benefit, mutual outcomes, and then cascade that down to industry agreements, which can then be leveraged by businesses. And then doing a lot more cultural awareness training. I mean, I think in Australia, we We look at China, very different culture, very different language. We understand we need to know more about how to do business. When we get to India, we seem very familiar. We know a lot of Indians. You know, we're speaking English, some common interests. Surely, you know, they're just like us, it's very easy. But there's a lot of cultural differences that companies really need to understand, particularly negotiation style, how to get through to contract stage, all those sorts of things, all the different drivers for decision making. It's not always just about price. There's all sorts of factors. So really giving Australian companies and perhaps Indian companies understanding how we work and our differences to make it a lot easier for companies to work together. So I think I'll finish up there, Peter.
Great, thanks very much, Louise. Interesting. So we've got the proposition versus the skepticism, the lack of knowledge. How do we bridge the difference? Well, let's get a perspective from Indian business on this. So over to Pranav from the CII.
Thank you very much, Peter. And Amitendra has already very comprehensively captured the India economic reforms journey so far. So let me also try to present Indian industry perspective on India economic reforms and the journey so far. I would not like to go back too far, but since 2014, when the current government assumed the office, and I would like to, so that would be my first part of intervention. Second part would be India's trade policy, because that is extremely important, and not only from the interest of our trading partners, but of course, even though from our own interest of reviving manufacturing or getting integrated into the global value chain. So we have to fix our trade policy very soon. Third part of my intervention would be what could be the potential areas of cooperation between India and Australia, because that is also extremely important. The other day when we were discussing, I mentioned about that both India and Australia, they have prepared their respective economic strategy paper from Australian side, and of course from Indian side we have prepared. So it is very important that the recommendation of those two strategy papers must be looked at seriously, and how we can take it forward in terms of serious implementation. So now coming back to the first part of my intervention, that is India economic reform. So what I would, we see that there is a three phase of it since 2014 to 2019. And there's a brief period when there has been onset of outbreak of COVID pandemic that was in February, March last year. And there was, of course, a brief crisis management period, I would say, not only from Indian government, but of course, industry also. We suffered a lot in terms of massive disruption in supply chain. And of course, when we saw that we have to live with this pandemic is going to prolong for God knows for how many months, years. So then we gave the narrative that let's try to create how we can convert crisis into opportunity. That was a narrative given by government, and also as a result of that, we came out with this whole idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which Amitendra has explained in detail, and also the scheme like production linked incentive scheme. So all those policies came out of that, how we can leverage this crisis situation. And so let me just go back a little bit about the background of Atmanirbhar Bharat and also the PLI scheme, because when the pandemic happened, that was in February, March, and we all know that we have a huge concern with China with regards to the huge trade deficit. And some of the sectors and products, for instance, pharmaceutical sector, India has a very vibrant pharmaceutical sector, but we are critically dependent on China for raw materials and ingredients. 65% of our API, that is active pharmaceutical ingredient, that comes from China. Solar power sector, we are hugely dependent on China for import of solar panel and all. Capital good industry. So there is a reason behind it why India was trying to minimize its exposure to the world, given the situation which pandemic has created. And that led to the announcement of the Atmanirbhar Bharat or self-reliant India. There is nothing wrong in that concept. Only thing, this has to be like, it has to be a vision which has to be realized over a period of time, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 15 years time period. But what Amitendu has mentioned, that as a result of our self-reliant emphasis, over the years, we have also raised the tariff, custom duties on range of products. And that was, of course, that did not go well with many of our trading partners, many of foreign companies, those who are heavily relying on very seamless functioning of their production network and value chain. So if I summarize the India's economic reform journey since 2014, core of it is, of course, how we revive our manufacturing, how to build our domestic manufacturing. And of course, that was only not with the help of domestic capital, but also foreign capital. So since 2014, we adopted several economic policy reforms that was pertaining to how we can create a more conducive business climate for foreign players, foreign companies to operate in India. So at this point of time, we have very open foreign direct investment regime. So if you see India's FDI policy, it's very open, very liberal also. When we thought that, of course, that is the only necessary condition for you to attract foreign direct investment. But we need other peripheral issues, other supportive issues, supportive policies, so that foreign companies, foreign MNCs can operate in a more conducive business climate. So then if you look at the Make in India initiative, which India launched in 2014, when simultaneously we launched the Digital India, Skill India, we tried to strengthen our IPR regime. We also launched the Startup India. So all those supportive policies we initiated and we launched because that would have supported not only foreign companies, but Indian large companies also, those who wanted to venture into India's manufacturing space. So that was the core of India's economic reform program ever since 2014. But of course, manufacturing revival is, of course, it's not a kind of overnight affair. It has a long gestation period, and we have to wait a long period for the actual results to come. Manufacturing revival also important from one more perspective, because India, you know, that's 1.4 billion population. So we're always challenged on job front, job and livelihood. So if you see the India's economic development so far, of course, India was hugely dependent on agriculture. Still, close to 60% of people are dependent on agriculture. But if you look at the journey towards economic development over the years, after the contribution of agriculture came down in GDP, that was overtaken by the services sector. That, of course, that's not the normal trend. And if you look at any other countries, the share of agriculture, when it goes down, then manufacturing takes over, and finally the services takes over. But India has bypassed this manufacturing revival, and as a result of that, the services sector has overtaken, and at present 60% of our GDP comes from services sector. So, but if you look at the services sector also, which are the sectors have developed over the years? It's IT, enabled services, financial services, telecom services. So those are sectors where we need more soft skill, and where the surplus labor, surplus workers in agriculture sector cannot be absorbed. So if you want to create a more productive jobs and more gainful employment for the people who are in agriculture sector, those who are disguisedly employed in agriculture sector, So we need to revive our manufacturing because the people who are in rural areas, they cannot be trained to get employment in IT sector. They get employment in education sector or telecommunication sector. At best, they can be trained as a factory worker and they can be employed in manufacturing. So manufacturing was, of course, that was very, very critical. And that is also, that realization came also when we signed free trade agreement with ASEAN, Japan, Korea, and Malaysia in 2009, 10, 11. And as a result of that, when we realized that we are not able to penetrate those markets because those markets are highly competitive, dominated by manufacturing giants like China, Japan, Korea, and some of the ASEAN countries. So we realized that unless and until we revive our manufacturing, we strengthen our manufacturing, we also cannot leverage the free trade agreements. So that realization came, and that also was the background why we went for a very massive program like Make in India. Now, my second point is the India trade policy, why India is protective, and India has gone over the years. And Peter, you also mentioned about that particular WTO issues. India and Australia, they sit on the two sides of the spectrum. So, and that is what we are also trying to see how we can gradually and slowly try to fix our trade policy strategy. Because when we talk about foreign direct investment, global value chain, production network and all, so we have to have a very supportive trade policy. Both investment policy and trade policy have to support each other. So that kind of understanding, that kind of initiative we need to pursue in India. And so, but of course that will take time but we have seen in particular free trade agreements and why India has the process toward free trade agreement has slowed down and why we have withdrawn from RCEP. RCEP, anyway, that's a different story altogether because still we are trying to decipher what went wrong with RCEP because for close to 7 years, 2012, 2019, we have been intensively engaged in RCEP negotiation. 2 times we hosted also. Close to 100 consultations happened in India with industry members. That was unprecedented. That never happened with in the past when we were negotiating with Singapore, Australia, in Singapore or ASEAN, Japan, Korea. So RCEP in any way was a kind of revelation for us because government was very, very intensively engaged. A lot of consultations happened, but at the end of the day, we had to withdraw. So that's a different story altogether. But more importantly, if you see the industry perspective on FTAs in India, so after signing free trade agreement with ASEAN, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore and all, we have not been able to demonstrate much benefit to industry in terms of greater exports particularly. So that was kind of, that has confused not only the industry, but also the government because we thought that we have got a preferential access in these markets and we are not able to access those markets. So that diluted the enthusiasm both industry and the government with regards to free trade agreement. And you can see the situation since 2012. We have not been able to negotiate or sign any free trade agreement, except the Mauritius one, which we have signed very recently. RCEP anyways looks like a closed chapter, but of course, as Amithendu has mentioned that now there is a renewed emphasis on reviving the FTAs with West, not only with the West, but the East also, Asia Pacific. And we are hoping that things will move fast. Other way, we were discussing also because India also needs to strengthen its negotiating team so that we can simultaneously handle multiple negotiation, not only with the EU, but the UK, Australia, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, GCC and all. So, on trade policy, of course, we have to bring more policy reforms so that we reach out to our trading partners, we reach out to foreign companies, those who want to operate a very seamless production network. Now, coming to the third part on India and Australia, how India and Australia can cooperate, irrespective of whether we go ahead with FTAs or not in the near future, which of course we can't speculate at this point of time. So if we look at the India's own economic strategy, which we developed for Australia, how we can engage with Australia, and that was, as I said, that was anchored by CII. There are three areas which we have narrowed down where Australia and India can cooperate. One is the resource security and resource management. Second is the technology and services, and third is research and innovation. So both India and Australia, if you see that we have a lot of complementarities, both have knowledge economy also. We have a good exposure in terms of people-to-people movement and also. So Australia can be a very productive and good partner in India's own manufacturing revival, particularly when if our manufacturing is getting revived, if there's a demand for resources and also, then Australia could be a good supplier because Australia is rich in mining, that's rich in agriculture, and Australia is a resource supplier to the world. Secondly, in automobile sector particularly, there is a renewed and more push towards electric vehicles, and there again, Australia could be a good supplier of natural resources for the electrical vehicle manufacturers. Other sectors could be, if you look at the more sectors where we can collaborate, education is very important, and that is of course interest areas of Australia, because Australia is an important destination for many of our students. So we look forward to more such collaboration between Australian university and Indian universities. Australia could also be good in terms of our digital transformation. In India has, of course, is trying to scale up its digital economy up to $1 trillion. Tourism is another sector. Australia is a very vibrant tourism sector, and India is also trying to revive, of course, because of the short disruption because of COVID, but we hope that things would normalize and we can move ahead. The another area where Australia and India can collaborate, that is pharmaceuticals and health, which is again extremely important because of the COVID and all. We can collaborate on the generic manufacturing because if you see the current India-Australia exposure on pharmaceuticals, Australia import from India the generic drugs, that is not very substantial. So that is one area we can see how we can increase our generic drugs to increase the exports of generic drugs to Australia. Hospital management, and also there are large number of areas. If you see the strategy papers, so of course we have identified at least 12, 13 sectors where India, Australia can collaborate and we can really complement. And final point, of course, the agribusiness. And that is one area where we are trying to see, because if you look at India's own agriculture sector, we are the world largest producer of milk. We are one of the largest producer of fruits and vegetables and all. But we are not able to process, because if you look at India's processing rate, that is 6 to 7% against the global average of 27, 28%. So this is one area where, of course, Australia can invest and help India in agribusiness and agri-processing. So I would stop here and look forward for taking questions during discussion. Thank you.
Great, many thanks, Pranav. So the floor is now open to questions from our audience. We've really got a few in the Q&A. So what I'll do is I'll pose them to particular panelists, and I'll start with one that's certainly of interest to me, representing an Australian university. So this comes from Rahul Sen in New Zealand. And he's asking, what are the opportunities for Australian universities to expand their footprint into India, particularly given the COVID context and the, in essence, drying up of student flows from India into Australia itself? And perhaps I'll pose that to Amartyendu, who works for a university in Singapore, but still in the university sector, as well as Louise. So Amartyendu, you first, and then let's come to Louise.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks, Rahul, for this very interesting question. Before I get onto this question, just a little bit of statistic would be very interesting, I guess, for all of us to share, is that from ISAS, we are currently engaged in some work on the people-to-people connectivity within the Asia Pacific, and a part of that work is focusing on the movement of students, outward bound and incoming. And what we see is that with respect to Australia, the largest chunk of students are actually coming in from China, yes, but then significantly from India, almost as close to China, and then Nepal from South Asia, which continues to remain over the last 4 or 5 years, a very big driver of the movement of students coming into Australia. Now, Rahul's question is specifically on what happens to the exchange of students post-COVID-19, because clearly today, the opportunities for physical movement of students are going to get limited in terms of a large number of protocols which they have to do. But what I would like to emphasize on, and this is something which has, as I can see from Singapore, become quite a bit of a practice insofar as engaging with the rest of the world is concerned, is that when we move into the space created by the MOOCs, the massive open online courses within the higher end university space, I think the opportunities really expand in some respect. And this is when I'm talking about education that is clearly deliverable to the maximum possible extent within the online space. But I'm mindful of the fact that when it comes to a country like Australia, there is an interest when it comes to, let us say, the areas of skill building or tertiary education in terms of the polytechnic-based or ITI-based skills getting transferred. Now, that is an area where probably Australian universities and Indian universities at the end need to enter into much more specific bilateral collaborations. I'm aware of such collaborations existing between, let us say, the University of Sydney and the IITs or the Tata Institute for Social Sciences in India. So my short point, Rahul, is that, what I sense is that there's quite a bit of good work that's already been done in the pre-COVID era in terms of universities connecting to each other within the Indian and Australian education spaces. Now, all that is required now is to translate a large part of that connection and movements into a space where the digital capacities become the foremost medium for engaging. And I'm also aware of the fact that in India, sometimes capacities might not be uniform, yes. But I am hoping that with respect to the kind of students that were moving to Australia and are desirous of a higher education space from Australia will not get constrained by digital capacities at their home end. So I think that will continue to flourish.
Thanks, Amartyendu. Louise?
Yes, well, not from the university sector, but being from the manufacturing sector, forgive me for focusing when it comes to higher education on VET and vocational education, which is really very important for the Australian manufacturing sector, but also really important for the Indian manufacturing sector as it develops and engages with the world. And I think what is sometimes missing in the VET, we think of TAFEs going out just selling courses, but really the success of the Australian VET system is the integration of industry associations and the education institutions, so that industry gives early warning of what skills are required. Industry associations such as our group host apprentices that we place into member companies. We nurture them and mentor them, make sure that they have a number of other skills, not just the practical skills, and then also the institutions, the TAFEs, provide some of the more detailed skills. One of the things that our group has been very conscious of is how do we make sure that that traditional apprenticeship model is ready for Industry 4, the next generation of manufacturing. So we've been working with Swinburne University as an example and Siemens to develop a higher technology apprenticeship. And I think that sort of collaboration, we could share some of that knowledge with India and their institutions and the CII potentially to really lift the whole marketplace up.
Thanks, Louise. So we have a number of questions around, let me say, security-related sectors, two in particular, rare earths and defense components specifically. I'm not sure who on our panel is best placed to answer these questions, but I'll turn to Pranav first of all. And I guess the underlying framing of this is, how do you see collaboration in those two sectors particularly unfolding? So rare earth and defense components particularly.
Yeah, so defense production particularly is, of course, one of the priority areas for Government of India. As you know, that India is one of the largest buyer of, largest importer of defense equipment. And when we talk about developing our own manufacturing capability, so defense equipment, defense product also appears at the top of India's list of items. And over the years, if you see the policy development with regards to defense manufacturing, for last 5-6 years, we have significantly liberalized foreign direct investment and other related policy with regards to defense manufacturing. And the many Indian companies are also, they're taking a huge amount of interest, particularly they are trying to invest in this area, this sector. More importantly, if you look at the defense sector, this is very capital intensive, and this is also technology intensive. So we need more collaborative work, particularly with the country like Australia, USA, and many of the European countries, so that we can develop. So that is one part of it, developing our capability for defense production. Second part is also has been an increased emphasis on the exports of defense product, because that would also help in India. Because if you see our own export basket, in India export basket, particularly on the merchandise front, it has been more or less same last 30-40 years. Same textiles, same gems and jewelry, leather products, some of the agriculture products we are exporting. We have not been able to penetrate into high-tech products. Even the automobile sector also, that is one of the success story of India's manufacturing. We are not a major exporter of automobile. Most of the major automobile companies in India, they are only for the domestic market. Only recently we have seen that some exports are happening. So automobile and particularly defense also. Defense we are trying to develop in a big way. Not only defense manufacturing capability, but also the defense export also.
Great, thanks, Pranav. And I think, Louise, you wanted to comment on this as well.
Well, this may be a live example of what I was talking about, where old thinking, and it could be my fault. I still have in my mind that defense companies, defense investment still requires a 50-50 joint venture partner in India. And that's certainly a barrier for some of our members. There's a lot of interest in defense in India. We say it's a big market for defense products, and defense primes are not slow in directing their suppliers where they should be, create a footprint so that they can support the market. But compliance, supply chain compliance is really tough in defense. You need to know exactly who's working, who has access to your IP, where your products will end up, and what are the inputs into your product. So that joint venture provision is a barrier. So it may have changed, and we don't know. And this is my point. We need to reintroduce India, I think, to the Australian market.
Right. Thanks, Louise. Amitendra, did you want to talk to the rare earths issue? You did mention it in your opening remarks, but I'm not sure what work you've done on it or what knowledge you might have of it.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think this understanding is pretty much there when we look at specific elements of the India-Australia collaboration part. In terms of the reports that have come both on the Australian side as well as on the Indian side, the Peter Verghese report on the Australian side as well as the CII Commission report on the Indian side, and further work that has happened thereafter. And also drawing in from the larger partnerships that India and Australia are a part of, including the Quad and let's say the resilient supply chain. I think there's very little doubt about the fact that when it comes to rare earths, there is a common understanding between both India and Australia that there is this imperative to address excessive sourcing and monopolization of rare earth mining. And to that extent, some collaboration on ground has to take off. And there has been conversation in this regard between a joint working group that has been set up on both sides. But I think the question that is looming at this point in time is that much of what we are discussing today would clearly have been reporting of greater positives and progress had we not been discussing this in the context of COVID. And because of the presence of COVID in both countries and the impact that it has created on the functioning of enterprises, including conversations, I think there have been progresses which have been registered partially. But unfortunately, they have not been able to proceed the way they should have had we been in a non-COVID state, which is not going to be possible. But what I would like to emphasize on when it comes to rare earth is the fact that, yes, certainly going ahead, an extremely important area of collaboration, collaboration which is very likely to produce positive results, provided on the Indian side and the Australian side, there is an understanding on the question of standards, practices, and regulations that are acceptable to each other. Because I'm quite sure that when it comes to mining, there is already a degree of familiarity between the Indian and Australian mining sectors that has happened over the years. And rare earths is an opportunity that is backed by that obtained familiarity as well as a geopolitical and economic necessity. So I'm quite sure that this certainly will be one of the sectors that could be one of the early harvest sectors between the two countries.
Right, thanks, Amitendra. We actually have a defence sector specialist on the line, so to speak, who's posing these questions. That's Dr. Nathan Gray. And we're going to bring him up onto the panel, I think, or at least get him to speak, and so that he can say something about this. Nathan, are you available?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Yeah, can't see me. That's okay. Look, the reason I asked the question is, in terms of the defence industry, obviously India has had a long-standing focus on Russian technology, but it has started to move away from Russian technology towards some Western systems. I know, having done some work in the defence industry in India previously, there is demand for some of our technology that we create in Australia, which feeds onto these platforms. We don't produce major systems, but it's that collaboration with high technology, small components that could fit directly with suppliers in the Indian market. And I wonder whether there's ways of us harnessing some of the platform consistencies that we have between Australia and India. And, you know, India, for example, have engaged the Naval Group for a range of maritime systems, just as Australia has for our submarines. That's where I'm really driving this. I think there's opportunities there. And even within the Make in India platform, there should be collaboration opportunities. And that's probably a large area where I think we can grow.
Great, thanks, Nathan. I'll take that as a comment. Let's move on to a couple of other questions. So we have a question about the SCRI, which I think is the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative with Japan and India. And the question, I guess this goes particularly to Pranav and Louise. It's how can the manufacturing and services activities, including things like rare earths and defense sectors, be supported and increased into the core areas identified in the CII Economic Strategy for Australia report. So let's start with you, Pranav. I hope that question is clear. It's really around the SCRI framing and how that could be leveraged.
Yeah, so that is an important initiative and launched very recently. And we are, of course, involved with both Japan and Australia. And that talks about creating a resilient supply chain. And as I mentioned in my own intervention, that at least India has withdrawn from RCEP, but this kind of arrangement at least provides some kind of cushion to India to remain engaged with the Asia Pacific, which is of course a very vibrant region. And India has a long-standing strategy to engage with the Asia Pacific region. India has a locust policy, now it is activist policy. Even for the free trade agreement also, India has first looked eastward and now looking westward. So, so as far as SCRI is concerned, we'll still have a long way to go because, of course, there has been some discussion whether it would be only India, Japan, Australia, whether we will have ASEAN also, because those discussions are still going on. That is more strategic in nature. So at this point of time, of course, from industry point of view, we have very little to contribute because it's just started last year only. And because of this COVID and pandemic, it is not going at a great pace, but this is extremely important. And we are hoping that at some point of time, industry will come more actively, more proactively on board and take this initiative forward.
Great, thanks, Pranav. Louise, anything to add?
No, I agree. It's a great framework. We're yet to see material changes for a lot of industry. I think the challenge with these agreements is how it will play in the marketplace. And the fact is everyone's interested in alternative supplies for critical minerals and these rare earths, but the market drives things and the market is driven by price, and that still is, a lot is still sourced from cheaper countries.
Hence we see the Chinese exports to the US have hit record levels, for instance, despite the geopolitical tensions. Okay, moving on. I've got a question about one of my current favorite topics, which is the EU's carbon border adjustment measures. So the specific framing of the question is there an opportunity for India and Australia to work collaboratively on renewable technologies in this context, such as in the production of green hydrogen, a big issue for South Australia, but Australia more generally. And I suppose the underlying issue there is to what extent could we co-invest in order to dodge the CBAM bullet. Let me flick that one to Amutendu, and then I'm sure Pranav and Louise will want to comment as well. So Amutendu.
Sure, I think at the outset, look, I think a border adjustment tax and a carbon border adjustment tax at that has its own principles, of course, and there is no questioning those principles. But at the same time, I think the implementation of it, and I'm sure you and I would agree on this point, and probably substantively, that there are major issues involved in the implementation, and there are major impacts of that implementation as far as the EU's trading partners are concerned. Now, what I sense is that I'm not entirely confident that this border adjustment tax will actually continue to be implemented, much as it's not going to come into implementation right now. Will continue to be implemented in the way it has been proposed, because the EU is a region with which the trade engagement of various parts of the world is very strong, but those engagements feature very heterogeneous partners. Having said that, acting on sustainable trade and working on sustainable trade mobility practices is important. That's something which the EU is going to champion consistently. The advantage that India probably has at this juncture is that it is already into a conversation with the European Union on a comprehensive trade agreement and an investment protection agreement, apart from a third country connectivity partnership agreement. So there's a lot of engagement that is there on the table. And there is similarly engagement between India and Australia on a large number of fronts. Now, I'm not saying that this automatically means that India and Australia will be able to arrive at a bilateral solution which will enable them to, what you described as dodging this particular border provision. But what I think is likely to happen is that the EU will be mindful over the fact that India and Australia are important partners to stay engaged with in the Indo-Pacific for greater comprehensive interests. And it is important to listen to their perspectives on this subject, so much so that there remain possibilities of adjusting the CBM in terms of what the perspectives of a large number of trade partners are, because Australia is a very important resource trade partner for the EU. India is an extremely important partner for the EU in a large number of respects. So I think the possibility of the conversation continuing between India and Australia on this subject is a good scope. But having said that, I'm not entirely confident at this stage, at least, that there will be the emergence of a very clear template or agenda in this regard.
Okay, thanks, Amitendo. Louise, anything to add on this point?
Well, our group's done quite a bit of work looking at the impact of CBAM on Australian exports to EU, and we've determined that it won't actually have any significant impact on the profitability in the EU market. We don't export a great deal of the captured products, but as a trade person, it pains me to say it probably won't have that much impact, even though it does appear to be more tariffs and more paperwork, which of course we inflexibly reject. But the thing that concerns me about CBAM, where I think perhaps India and Australia could work together, is this unilateral determination of what is a carbon price. And we risk, as other countries try to grapple, other countries obviously are dealing with carbon reduction schemes and trying to put a price on carbon. We need more collaboration on what that looks like, just as we do with anti-dumping duties and a whole lot of other things that we do at the border. What concerns us is this will take us into one direction. Japan perhaps will introduce one, the US will introduce one, and the complexity for a company will just be too much. So we really need much more international collaboration on that front.
Completely agreed. Pranav, anything else to add on this?
Yeah, so I agree with Amitendo. So bilaterally, India and Australia, of course, in principle, can move forward, but some of the issues we have to have multilateral solutions. So, of course, the climate change, carbon border adjustment tax, and all. Similarly, if we compare with the trade protectionism, also bilaterally, we can agree that we will not go for trade restrictive measures, but of course, that also requires a global kind of multilateral solution. Because the world is getting interconnected, whether it's with regards to the climate change or with regards to trade protectionism. So both requires a multilateral solution. Bilaterally, of course, we can, in principle, agree and try to lend our support. But in terms of actual result, I'm not sure how far we can move forward.
Great, thanks. I'm going to start to draw a line under this now. I sense our energies are flagging a little bit. It's a long time to be online. I'll pose this last question or clustering of questions to Louise because they're about Australian industry. And then ask Amitendo and Pranav to wrap up with any final remarks. And obviously, Louise, if you've got anything to add, please throw it in. So in essence, the framing of these questions are about, firstly, what could excite corporate Australia to engage with India? And then secondly, what is the role of a potential trade agreement within that?
Yes, well, that's why we didn't aim so high as to excite companies, just to give them confidence to have a look. But what could excite? I mean, obviously they need a market, and they need a market that's reliable and profitable. And I think the perception is, you know, Indians are hard negotiators and may not be as profitable of a market as others have been. So that might be something that we bridge that we need to get over in terms of communicating the benefits for India. That per unit, the profit might not be so great, but you win on the volume. That might be the one. And I think the other thing is understanding, as I said, the joint venture rules, the regulatory reforms. That's because it's quite opaque at the moment for an average Australian business. You know, they're not necessarily reading Indian financial newspapers on a regular basis, so they don't actually understand all the reforms and how it might have affected their business. So that's really, I guess, the job of Austrade to communicate that and to get people excited. So the last question on the FTA.
Yeah, is there a role for a free trade agreement from an Australian perspective, Australian business perspective particularly?
Potentially, but the challenge will be tariffs. So from a manufacturing point of view, industrial tariffs are not normally that high, but I think in India they are. An FTA could help with, you know, standards, mutual recognition on standards, and, you know, testing and all that sort of thing that would help. But I think, you know, we don't need to try to do everything at once. I think industry by industry agreements, you know, as I said, starting with the government and then industry associations and leverage onto the businesses in those areas that Pranav has already identified, you know, critical minerals, ag tech and innovation. I think they're really the important things to do. So we strengthen the ties. Otherwise, it just ends up being about, you know, sending each other commodities, and that's not a long-term business.
Great, thanks, Louise. So Pranav, any concluding thoughts or comments?
Yeah, so the two questions you have posed, one, of course, what could excite Indian and Australian business to collaborate? So in fact, in my initial intervention also, I mentioned that India and Australia have a huge complementarities across several sectors in manufacturing and services space. And of course, mining and resources and agriculture, where irrespective of whether we have any kind of institutional trade architecture through FTAs and all, we can go ahead with our collaboration. And in fact, we are working with Indian businesses. They have also shown great amount of interest in engaging with Australia, particularly in mining, sourcing raw materials, developing, having a joint venture in mining equipment, technology and all. Similarly, on agribusiness, agro-processing also, Australia can provide a lot of value to Indian agriculture sector, which is, of course, it's very vast, very disintegrated. We need to bring more value to and more kind of production network and supply chain in case of agriculture sector in India, where Australia can be a good support to us. As regards the FTAs, as I keep emphasizing that at this point of time, the more actions which we are seeing in India, that is on the EU and UK. And we are very optimistic. We are hopeful that just within a few years of time, both the agreements will be formalized. So once that happens, particularly EU1, and that will break the jinx, because there are many areas where India will have to engage, whether it's labor or environment, government procurement, some of the agriculture products and all. So that would pave the way for engagement or formalizing our trade agreement with countries like Australia and New Zealand and Canada and all. So that is my own personal reading, that once EU happens, so that will open a kind of a gate for Australia and New Zealand, and that would be the next in the priority list of India.
Great, thanks very much, Pranav. And Amartyendu, the final word goes to you.
Thanks, Peter. I just have a couple of submissions. The first is, I think that collaboration need not always proceed through the bilateral avenue. I think the advantage that India and Australia enjoy at this point in time is that spaces for collaboration have been created through a number of frameworks. There is the Quad Partnership Framework. The vaccines are an important point to start off working with. It very clearly mentions the areas where India and Australia can utilize their comparative strengths to take this partnership forward. And it's quite a humongous partnership. The vaccines and pharma are going to remain important areas of collaboration for both countries in the foreseeable future. Similarly, the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative that we alluded to is again an area where there is a considerable bit of dovetailing, which can grow out of the bilateral space into a somewhat limited multilateral country-specific collaboration involving both India and Australia. And that should, to my mind, give sufficient cause for cheer to businesses on both sides to look at their collaboration closely. And the final point on the FTA, Peter, is I think an FTA would do a lot of good to both Indian and Australian business understandings. But much as a rose might be called by any name, it doesn't really matter. I think an India-Australia FTA need to be looked at not just necessarily from the prism of the way FTAs are defined or the kind of FTAs that Australia has signed with other countries or the kind of FTAs that India has got into. It might be a very distinct FTA by itself. It might just be a trade understanding which is flowing out of the current prism of their relationships. It might focus more on investment. It might focus more on standards. It might focus more on education. But to me, the biggest takeaway on an India-Australia economic relationship at this point in time is that I think that economic relationship is getting a lot of backing from not just Indian and Australian governments, but from a whole host of countries who are actually interested in India and Australia collaborating very closely as part of larger multi-country networks. I think that for me is the biggest cause for cheer and enthusiasm.
Great, thanks very much, Amitendra. And I'd like to also thank our panel for their inputs and for engaging so actively in the conversation. I'd also like to thank our audience for participating and for all the very good questions that you sent through. And then finally, last but by no means least, the IIT and ISAS teams that in the background have pulled this webinar together. And I'm sure it's the first of many collaborations to come. So I look forward to seeing everybody online again soon and wish you the best for the rest of the day or for the night, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much and good night from Adelaide.
You're welcome, Peter. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you very much, Peter. Amit.